Radke here. We've got our guests. We actually have an extra panelist. We have Esmy Jimenez. We have Paul Kiefer. We have Breda. We have Isabella's cat, which I'd be happy to hear from. Don't muzzle that cat. I enjoy a good cat meow. I have a couple myself. But we're going to get back to covering the big stories of the week, what happened this week, and what it all means. Don't go away, and we can review.
Great tale.
So long.
Support for KUOW comes from Fifth Avenue Theater's new production of Disney's Beauty and the Beast, a tale of a young woman in search of something more and a beast who is more than he seems to be, playing January 12th to February 6th. Info on tickets and health and safety at fifthavenue.org.
If the test we set for ourselves is this ailment dangerous enough to literally kill American democracy, that is setting a really high bar for considering this a serious problem.
I'm Michael Barbaro. That's Today on the Daily from the New York Times.
You'll hear that this afternoon at 2 o'clock on 94.9 KUOW Seattle. But right now, we continue with KUOW's Week in Review.
I'm Bill Radke. I'm with Publicola's police accountability reporter, Paul Kiefer. We've got Everett Herald City's reporter, Isabella Breda, Seattle Times mental health reporter, Esmy Jimenez, and we're figuring out what happened this week and what it all means. Governor Inslee says he's considering sending in the National Guard to help hospitals overwhelmed by COVID patients. The leader of the State Hospital Association, Cassie Sauer, says that hospitals are treating nearly 1,400 people, more than double from last month.
There's been a huge jump in people 25 to 49-year-old coming to the emergency room looking for minor COVID care. There's a federal law that requires us to screen and stabilize every patient who comes, and it is causing a huge backlog in our ERs. It's jeopardizing care for people with true emergencies, and it is totally burning out our staff.
Right. The minor COVID care, you've heard a lot about how the Omicron variant is relatively mild, but when you increase the numbers like this, then you get crowds, you get some people going to hospitals, whether they are in an emergent situation or not. You've got health providers having to stay home and isolate because of COVID. You've got healthcare workers just emotionally and physically exhausted. And Governor Inslee points out that calling out the National Guard doesn't just fix all that.
If you have a nurse who's in the Guard and they're working at a hospital in their civilian life, so taking people out of the civilian workforce in healthcare, plugging them back in, that doesn't solve the problem.
Esmy Jimenez, we are once again playing catch up. We don't have enough hospital capacity. You can't find a COVID test or appointment. What do you think the lesson is here?
I think the lesson is that we haven't learned our lesson.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've been seeing, right, this is the fifth or sixth wave. And two big things that I think about are one, lag time between variants, how we communicate. And usually the media has 1 to 2 weeks, right, where we're saying, hey, we don't know yet, stand by. There's a new variant. We don't know exactly what it is, but stand by. People sometimes follow up on that. Sometimes they don't. Then we start getting a little bit more information from studies, from scientists who say, yes, this is a milder variant, or this variant is more about coughing. This variant is worse still for the unvaccinated, as always. And then we actually have those catch up and the numbers show up on our data dashboards. And then journalists will go back out and report that. And by that time, right, it might be 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And now people are reading like, oh, are we supposed to be using different masks? Oh, where do I get a test? What are the symptoms for COVID again? And so that entire life cycle of getting information out is too slow. It's not nimble enough. And I'm saying that as a reporter, and I think about how I can message better to the communities. I think more about how public health can message information out. Like, what can we do to be more nimble? We've been through 5 or 6 waves of this now. It doesn't seem like it's going to stop this year. So what are we going to do differently about that? Yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, and I should always mention that when I talk about whether the Omicron variant is mild or not, it depends on so much, and a big factor is whether you're vaccinated, whether you're boosted, but also you could be vulnerable, you could be older, you could be a young child, et cetera. The state is seeing more than 10,000 new cases a day, more than 1,000 COVID patients hospitalized over the past week. UW Medicine is postponing some elective surgeries. Patients can only have one visitor for an hour during visiting hours. You've got the state saying that they've got 5.5 million at-home COVID tests on the way here, and those are going to be distributed to schools and underserved communities through a website that'll be up soon. The state's getting more KN95 masks to give out to underserved communities and K through 12 schools. King County's bought another 400,000 COVID test kits on top of 300,000 that it had already ordered. Isabella, what is the picture where you are in Snohomish County?
Yeah, so someone was on Twitter the other day, but they posted like drone footage of the waiting line at a COVID testing site that had wrapped around like multiple city blocks. I mean, that's the situation pretty much everywhere. I was possibly exposed, and just trying to find a test anywhere is pretty much impossible unless you just sit on the site and keep refreshing and see if someone cancels theirs. Our county health officer just told one of our reporters earlier this week that it's possible that like up to 5% of residents have contracted COVID just in the last 2 weeks. And that's in our county in entirety. And so I've been covering the city of Edmonds as they've been debating whether or not to continue allowing their little parklet program. It's actually called Strateries there, and it's just outdoor dining like in parking spaces along the streets. And this is something that I don't think anyone anticipated would be going on this long into the pandemic. We're going into our second anniversary of COVID being around, and we're still having to do these measures that people thought were just temporary things. And, there's city council members debating the fact that, indoor dining is still permitted under the governor's orders. And there's a sense of people just being fatigued, having pandemic fatigue and wanting things to go back to normal, which is obviously, contributing to the rise in cases beyond just this super highly contagious variant. But there's council members debating whether or not, it's important to continue having these creative measures because, it's not as deadly, or the numbers don't show that it's as deadly right now. And I think, again, like Esmy was saying, we need to have that messaging of sharing, what people's risks are, how the vaccine does help in those cases, or at least allow for a more mild case of COVID, and making sure that people are aware of what resources are out there, because it seems like, counties and cities, for the most part, are doing the best they can, but they're clearly strapped for resources. So,
Paul, you report on the criminal legal system. What is Omicron doing to jails and prisons?
So there is a relatively smaller outbreak going on at the Monroe Correctional Facility up in Snohomish County right now, and that involves at most recent numbers I saw were 67 confirmed cases. People who test positive are being placed in what were previously they're still isolation cells. They were used for things like disciplinary solitary confinement, but now they're functioning as quarantine cells. But here in King County, 3 days after, actually fewer than 3 days after Christmas, just after Christmas, in a 3-day span, 20 people in King County jail custody tested positive. That was the first kind of big surge for months over the summer and the early fall. Positive cases fell down to 10 or below consistently. For a while, they were in the low single digits. So we're going to see, and we already have seen, the Omicron wave arrive in one of the most vulnerable concentrated populations in the county. It's sort of jails and shelters are the two most vulnerable places. And this comes just as the King County Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention and Jail Health, which is run through King County Public Health, had just kind of reached a milestone in vaccinations within the jail. They had reached about a 65% vaccination rate, which is lower than the county average. And it's not a perfect data point because the jail population changes. I mean, the average person spends 30 days in jail. So if you're looking at a vaccination percentage in August, when things were, well below 60% versus now, you're not looking at the same group of people. So keeping vaccinations high is a, it's a moving target. But one way or another, it was sort of a moment of victory for jail health that was then quickly cut short by the arrival of the Omicron wave. And as we know, Omicron is people who are vaccinated are still vulnerable to Omicron. So jail health is probably not going to give up their vaccination campaign anytime soon. They're offering vaccines to people at intake and at medical check-ins and all that. But it's still a vulnerable population with very high turnover, and one of the larger public health challenges that the county will have to deal with.
Speaking of public health challenges, Paul, you mentioned that another of the most dangerous places from a COVID point of view is shelters, which really came into focus over the last many days. We're just now defrosting from the sub-zero temperatures, or sub-freezing, I should say, and we had the head of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority reminding us how deadly that is for some people.
Exposure deaths actually start at around 40 to 45 degrees. So when we talk about 25 degrees, between 5 and 10 degrees at night, these are really lethal conditions.
So let's talk about how much our governments and private businesses and people were able to help their neighbors. Isabella, how much was the Snohomish County area able to step in an emergency weather situation?
Yeah, so it's actually been pretty heartbreaking learning about what systems are in place to support and take care of people when it's freezing out. And it was like 7 degrees in Arlington one morning when I woke up, just looking at the temperature. And at that point, there was absolutely no emergency cold weather shelter in North Snohomish County. And this is something that, zero. There was not even one. That people would have to go to East County. There was a shelter in Monroe, and there's also one in Snohomish. And they're both operated by Volunteers of America volunteers, and they're held in churches. So it's really minimal space. It's kind of just like an ad hoc program. If they don't have enough volunteers, they can't necessarily continue the program. So it's all kind of just teetering on the edge there. And again, for someone who's unhoused to be able to get a bus pass to go that distance out there and maybe be stranded for days away from all of the resources that they're connected with, it makes it pretty impossible to actually get access to shelter. And people were choosing to, stay alive however they could. I know there are people out on the streets at night, just like using hot chocolate from the gas station to keep their hands warm, or whatever they could do to, stay alive essentially. And, nonprofit leaders were warning about this over the summer. There were some that were trying to get a shelter project established in Marysville that could, help fill that gap to some extent, because, churches had essentially dropped out of that area, saying that, we don't have the resources and we're looking for support from the city. And that just wasn't coming around. And then when COVID hit, it obviously complicates things, because they're, most of the time they're church volunteers, they're church goers, they don't have background in public health, and they don't know how to handle these sorts of situations. So it's just a lot of pressure coming down on nonprofits, and that shelter community didn't go through because there was a lot of pushback from a nearby neighborhood. And those nonprofit leaders felt that the city didn't do enough to educate people living in the area on the importance of having that there. And the result of that is ultimately people are vulnerable to death because of the weather. And finally, one church did come around in Marysville and open their doors as a cold weather shelter just for this year. And again, it becomes an issue of transportation, because they're kind of out there and isolated away from where a lot of people find warmth during the day, which is like libraries and restaurants and that sort of thing. So I guess, the cold weather just really highlighted how little people know about how important it is to have those resources available. They seem, simple, and they're temporary. It's only for a few months. It doesn't typically get this cold, but yeah. Yeah,
and that transportation issue gets even more acute if it's snowy and icy and you can't even get people where you're trying to get them to go in the first place. Paul, how did Seattle do?
Well, it's worth noting that, snow and cold temperatures are sort of a predictable thing in winter, and yet it seems like every time city government is sort of caught off guard by winter weather. And so we wound up setting up, we had separate, generally daytime and nighttime shelters set up mostly in the downtown core. There was one in Lake City, there was one in West Seattle as well. Not massive capacity, and the ones in downtown Seattle were more full than the ones kind of further afield, in part because, it's just a lot to ask people to move into shelters where you don't have a quasi-private sleeping area and storage for your stuff. People don't want to just leave their tents and emergency supplies and sleeping bags and somewhere and get to a shelter and risk losing all that. And then B, it's hard to get to the shelters because transportation is hard. The city gave out Metro bus tickets, but those weren't useful if a bus line was canceled or if it was running really sporadically. They're only slightly helpful. There were volunteers from the city out driving vans. And if someone was in a wheelchair and needed a van with a lift, that was harder to come by because the city needed volunteers with commercial driver's licenses to drive those vans. And a lot of the people with commercial driver's licenses were handling the snowplows, which was another essential service. It was and then, not to mention that running separate daytime and nighttime shelters means that you need to get people between them when, the change of guard comes along, which was another disincentive for people to go to shelters because, in some cases, the shelters were, a long way apart. So in general, it was not ideal. And the recommendations that unsheltered people kind of passed along were things like, for instance, Health One, which is a fire department program, was giving people hot drinks and blankets and hand warmers and stuff where they were. That's a helpful thing, finding people where they are so they don't have to move their stuff and making sure they have harm prevention or harm reduction supplies is useful. And then also having daytime and nighttime shelters be in the same place is another potentially good thing. But we need to plan ahead for that. We have the benefit of potentially the King County Regional Homelessness Authority taking over as of this year responsibility for running shelters, and maybe they can plan ahead more than the city has, so that we don't have to just sort of make up a plan on the fly, so that you have more uptake of shelter options when they're needed.
Yeah. Esmy Jimenez, what are your takeaways about this?
To Isabella and Paul's points, this is a very reactive system as opposed to one that's proactively planning beforehand. Homelessness has been an issue in the Seattle area for a long time, as well as throughout the Puget Sound region. Winter is predictably during the winter time. So surely things could be planned out better ahead of time. There's always going to be immediate challenges that are going to be much harder to immediately respond to, but some of the broad swaths I think could be planned out, whether that's actually making sure things are connected and making sure, again, those systems for daytime shelters versus nighttime shelters, if those are even 2 miles away, that's a huge barrier immediately to someone actually being able to stay warm during this entire cold moments. So those are times that I'm just what can we do in Seattle to both instill with city leaders that this can be something that should be planned out and taken care of more reasonably.
Yeah, Esmy, as predictable as it is, as you just said it is, what do you think prevents better planning for the predictable?
That is tough, right? That's trying to plan for the unexpected can be very scary. And I think for city governments, when there's a lot of money and there's a lot of agencies attached, you have to CC 12 people, you have to have a meeting on something that is going to create roadblocks. But I know that there have been other places that have done this well. So I believe that there are experts that are already working on this. We don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. That's Esmy Jimenez, Seattle Times mental health reporter. A beat that I love it. I'm so glad you're on, and we're going to talk more about it in just a moment, Esmy. We've also got the Everett Herald's cities reporter, Isabella Breda, with us, and Publicola's police accountability reporter, Paul Kiefer. And as we do on Friday, we're coming together and figuring out what happened this week and what it means. We are going to take a short break and be right back with more Week in Review. Don't go away.
There are a number of good reasons to support local journalism, but the best ones come from you. Michael from Lakewood said, KUOW is my connection to the world. I love exploring new ideas and hearing different viewpoints. My life would be less interesting if KUOW was not in it. Thank you, Michael, for your generosity. Support the news and storytelling based in facts and connectedness that we all rely on. Become a KUOW member today at KUOW.org.
Support for KUOW comes from Longhouse Memory Care, providing full care households for seniors with dementia. Longhouse believes that humans thrive in smaller environments. Learn more about memory care households for seniors in Bothell and Northgate at longhouse.com.
It is 45 degrees in Seattle. Chance of rain is with us through tomorrow, but we expect at least some sun on Sunday. It's 12:42, and this is KUOW's Week in Review.
I'm Bill Radke with Publicola's Paul Kiefer, Everett Herald's Isabella Breda, and at the Seattle Times, mental health reporter Esmy Jimenez, you wrote this week about an Orcas Island man who uses TikTok and a gray furry sock puppet to help a lot of people. So picture a squirrel looking out at a steady Pacific Northwest rain, talking about how awful life can seem.
You know, when we're in darkness, I think it's easy to get stuck there. It's like when you're in a nightmare, you have no idea you're dreaming. You think you're stuck there forever. Trust that this too will pass. That the extent to which you can suffer is the extent to which you can also experience joy, love, wholeness. Trust the survivor in you that's so strong and fierce. Or just let it all go just for a moment and look at this. This winter storm. It's chilly, windy and wet, and gorgeous. This is happening right now.
I love it. And so do a lot of people, especially young people, ask me. But first I got to ask, why a squirrel apparently from Boston?
Oh, that artist is named Evan Wagner Lynch. And like you said, he's from Orcas Island. He actually found that squirrel puppet in a bin at a Goodwill. And he was like, I'm going to grab this. I don't know what I want to do with it yet, but like, I'm going to hold on to something. And he said he's always been wanting to do kind of like a Mr. Rogers style show, but for adults. And as he was uncovering more about his mental health and healing and wellness, he was like, I wonder if I could mix this all up together into something. Then, of course, April 2020 hit. He was like, well, now that opportunity to do something with someone else is gone, but I guess I could use my cell phone and I have the squirrel puppet. So maybe like, what would I say? And he said, as he was playing with that squirrel puppet, he was like, okay, I know what I want to do with this. So that's how you get squirrel dialogues, this really viral TikTok account that I stumbled upon totally scrolling through TikTok. I did that. I was scrolling and then I suddenly was like, wow, this stuffed furry creature got me to take a deep breath, wonder, hey, why am I on my phone? You know, what are there healthier things that I could be doing? Like, So I told my editor about it and I was like, you know what, I think this is something interesting to talk about. It's local and it's really resonating with teens and a lot of Gen Z folks. And I could see even Paul and Isabella, as we're on the Zoom call, like their faces relaxed, they looked away, they smiled. And I was like, we need a little bit of something like that.
Not so long ago, I tweeted that I really wanted an adult version of Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers. I didn't know that I would want it to be a Muppet who sounds like Christopher Walken, but you know, it so happens that that's awesome.
Isabella, yeah, did you feel relaxed or something else by?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. And I had never come across this TikTok until recently, but just scrolling through the videos, I just kept watching one after another, and it's like, okay, like breathing, looking at a river, like it's so simple and it just takes you out of the moment and allows you to like decompress, and it's goofy, so it makes you feel like you don't have to take things so seriously. It's refreshing.
Yeah, and people say that fans of it say they feel safe. I can talk about the concepts that this squirrel is discussing, you know, the Buddhist philosophy and right, and psychology, and I can talk at my kids, but I think they'd probably rather hang out with the squirrel on this topic. And I love, Esmy, that you you know, we get down on social media sometimes, and
Really?
Right. And so it was refreshing to see that. And also I really liked how you conveyed this artist's sense of, he talks about the need for how many people out there. I think he described it as sort of hopeful, but heartbreaking and hopeful at the same time. How in touch he's gotten with the scale of suffering, how hopeless and lonely people are in a way that we don't always land on when we're talking about, hey, the news of the week, right? But it's so vital. I'm sorry, I'm talking about your beat. I would like you to say more about why you found that, why do you find this so important?
But I appreciate it. Well, to me, mental health is this universal thing. Like we all have physical health and we all have mental health. That those are the same thing. They're not different things. Our mental health affects our physical health. And I think more and more this last year, more people have understood, wow, I know now what anxiety feels like, right? Or if you went through really traumatic things, PTSD, depression, hopelessness, like these are symptoms, but they also are mental illnesses in some ways. So I think that overlap kind of lets us talk about bigger things and not such a scary way. I think the stigmatization of very severe mental illness, right, as this bizarre and scary thing, suddenly can be opened up when you realize too, like you have suffered as well, this pandemic, the pain, the death, that is very real. And it's painful to talk about, but the way to get through this is to get through this and talk about it. And so that's what I'm hoping that the Beat can do then, talking about mental health more with people. We can look both at systemic issues and how they interpersonally affect everyone.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. Before we leave this topic, Esmy, you also wrote about how hard it is to know when your mind isn't working well for you, which I think of as just the human condition, not knowing when my own mind is not serving me very well. But there is a specific neurological diagnosis here as well.
Yes. So I wrote about anosognosia. It's kind of this really clunky word, but it effectively is a phenomena that actually occurs with, again, severe mental illness. But it also occurs with people who have traumatic brain injuries, with people who are having dementia. It's just essentially the brain not being able to recognize itself. So the way that one doctor explained it to me is, so we can all take like photos, almost think of it as a metaphor of a camera. We can all point our camera and take a photo. But can we develop that photo? Can we go back to the dark room and see what we saw? With people who have anosognosia, they can't develop that per se. They took the photo, but it's just not showing up for them. So if you tell them, hey, Paul, I wanted to talk to you. I feel like maybe, you're showing symptoms of X, Y, and Z, some severe illness like schizophrenia, bipolar. And he'll say, but I feel fine. I'm fine. Like maybe you're the crazy one, And anosognosia is not like denial. It's not the same thing. Denial is more like a psychological structure that we use to protect ourselves. But anosognosia has to do specifically with the brain not being able to register itself being harmed. And that's really tricky because when you create policies and you say, well, we want to make sure people willingly choose treatment, if they cannot, again, actually develop that photo of themselves as being ill, they're never going to seek treatment. It's actually impossible for them to want to go seek treatment if they don't think of themselves as ill. And this is something that I wanted to write about because I think policymakers and more people, journalists included, need to kind of understand some of the finer intricacies so that in the pipeline of finding some kind of solution, we can say, well, this is the first issue, right? We don't talk about anosognosia, then we can't really develop good policies around it.
Mm-hmm. We could talk so much more about anosognosia. I'm looking at the clock, and I want to hit a few more things on our Week in Review program. But you can read more of Esmy's mental health work, reporting work, in the Seattle Times. And by the way, ANOSOGNOSIA, new word to start our new year. And a new year means new laws. I want to just make a little time to, if someone wants to sort of hit one of the new laws that take effect in 2022. Isabella, you were up at the Everett Herald. You've been looking, especially interested in the Native American mascot issue.
Yeah, so I cover the Tulalip tribes, and this has been an ongoing discussion since that was signed into law last June, I believe, which is changing any mascots that use like Native American images. That can be like mascots, logos, just like anything you're using for sports, for a school. Basically, the intent was that, these symbols shouldn't be used in educational environments. Oftentimes they're tokenizing Native American people. And so at Tulalip, the tribes, the board of directors asked the school district to change two of the school's mascots, the Toto Middle School Thunderbirds, Marysville Pilchuck High School Tomahawks. They did go through the process. There was a mascot committee. It was formally organized, mainly made up of students that went through and changed or came to a decision, picked a new mascot for each of the schools. And those were presented in December, which Totem Middle School picked a new mascot. They're now the Phoenix, but Marysville Pilchuck is still hung up because there's kind of a debate within the tribe, and it's a generational one, whether or not the mascot is something that they want to hang on to, because some elders have a sense of pride in the mascot. They think, back in the day, they didn't feel seen in school because there's only a handful of tribal members attending the school. And then there's the youth that are coming forward and saying, hey, we've experienced blatant racism as a result of the mascot. There's students from the Tillylip tribes that have been playing sports for the school and just felt like they had to grow a thick skin because they're having, war calls made in their direction. And they've just felt like, this is our opportunity to start making a change and not have that overt racism happening in our schools. But then there was a vote at the semi-annual general council meeting at the tribes where most of the elders were the ones in support of keeping the mascot. Some of the tribes reversed their initial decision, asking the school district to change the mascot. And said,
the mascot, Isabella, you were talking about war call. Tomahawks. Yep. So why did the typically elder tribal members, what did they say about why they felt a sense of, it's not especially local, right? It's not really a Coast Salish thing, no. Tomahawks, and it's such a specific kind of warlike image. What did they get? Why did they appreciate that?
Yeah, so the tomahawks were never used by the Coast Salish tribes historically. And so that's been something that I've been trying to figure out too, which is not necessarily clear from some of the elders I've spoken with why they're particularly tied to that. For them, it's more of just that there was any sort of Native American symbol that they felt they could identify with that was existing in the schools. Yeah, and again, it goes back to back in the day, their fight in schools was being seen. And now that, sensibilities have changed and people are coming forward and saying, this is harmful, the students and a lot of other tribal members feel that now is the time to make the change. So again, it's just becoming a intergenerational debate. So
yeah. Esmy Jimenez, what's a new state law 2022 that you want to highlight?
Probably already noticed it, but if you got any food deliveries this week or got food, you didn't get any utensils. I saw a friend of mine, she's like, oh, they forgot our stuff in here. Like, we didn't get a fork. And I was like, oh, you have to ask for that now. Probably should have mentioned to you that before you ordered. Yes. So you could have asked for those utensils. But yeah, we're trying to reduce plastic waste. And that's one of the things that's changing this week.
Yeah.
Or this year, rather, but this first week of the year.
You have to ask for it and consider, do you really need to ask for it? Paul, what about, meaning, do you really need that? Do you really need that plastic utensil is what I mean. Paul, what's another 2022 Washington state law?
You know me, I can't get away from policing. So new law, when police officers detain someone who's underage, under the age of 18, they're now required to give that person access to an attorney via a phone call, generally going to be accessible through a hotline. And when this bill was up for debate in the legislature last year, the law enforcement's argument was that would be a burden in the investigative process. If they spot someone who they think might have, stolen a car or something. They don't want to have to deal with, even if they're not going to detain the person completely, they don't want to have to deal with giving someone an attorney just for basic questioning. But youth rights advocates said this is, that young people are unusually vulnerable, uniquely vulnerable in interactions with police, whether it's a detention or not. And so it is therefore their right to have an attorney, and they are obligated to be given access to one. And so we will have a new hotline available, and we'll see if across the state this means that police wind up just stopping fewer young people. In Seattle, we're already seeing sort of a downward trend in the number of teenagers specifically being referred to diversion programs, because the police department is just simply, as far as I can tell, arresting fewer people for things like driving related crimes and minor shoplifting, which tend to skew younger. And so, it'll be hard to track the exact pattern that this bill could create, but one way or another.
It does have a new city attorney. Is that a factor?
Yeah, but the city attorney doesn't operate in a vacuum, and it's on some level a matter of law enforcement priorities, and on some level it's a matter of capacity. And I think across the board, it's sort of a wait and see. But it is a victory certainly for sort of the youth rights sphere that this hotline, or this requirement, is now online as of this year.
Okay, new state law there. By the way, speaking of Seattle city attorney, we just heard this morning that King County's prosecutor is not going to run for re-election, which is quite interesting. We're right out of time to talk about that, but we might discuss more what that might mean next week on Week in Review. We've only got, we've got about a minute left. I don't think I'm hardly going to. Anybody have a smile they want to share? One thing that made them smile at the end of the week? Isabella's cat on the Zoom. I loved. I've got one, just that John Ryan, KUOW reporter John Ryan, told me something I didn't know this week, that not only could we have flooding because of all the snow and rain, but this week we've had extra high tides called king tides.
It's kind of amazing to me that when the barometer drops and atmospheric air pressure goes down, the ocean will expand beyond what tide tables may have forecast. It's kind of like when you lift your head off a pillow, the pillow rises. Even though I have one of the mushy pillows that doesn't rise, I understood him and I learned something, that we live on a memory foam ocean. We are right out of time. I got to say my goodbyes. I'll just say that I smile every week when I get a chance to talk to journalists like you, and I'm so appreciative that you came and shared your knowledge with us again this week. Paul and Esmy and Isabella, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Great to have you. That's Esmy Jimenez, mental health reporter at Seattle Times. Paul Kiefer, police accountability reporter at Publicola. Isabella Breda, cities reporter at Everett Herald. And the show's produced by Kevin Kniestad and Sarah Leibovitz, with social media and live streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. Thanks for listening. I'm Bill Radke. Before you go, starting next week, you won't just get local news at noon on Fridays. Our daily noonday news show has returned with a new name and a new great host. So catch Soundside with host Libby Dankman starting Monday, the 10th.